told my mom about my dad and the abuse. She called me a liar and threatened to kill me if I told the police. These were the chilling words found in the diary of 17-year-old Bernadette Walker, a quiet, artistic teenager from Peterborough, England. A girl with dreams of capturing the world through her camera lens. But in the summer of 2020, Bernadette vanished without a trace. No goodbyes, no explanations, and, to this day, no body. Her disappearance revealed a web of lies, a family's darkest secrets, and a crime so shocking it left a nation searching for answers. What happened to Bernadette Walker? And why has her story remained an open wound for those seeking justice? Bernadette Walker was just 17 years old, a bright, creative photography student living in the quiet city of Peterborough, England. Her life seemed like that of any other teenager, filled with laughter among friends, dreams of artistic expression, and the typical ups and downs of adolescence. Bernadette came from a family of 9, close-knit on the surface, with her stepfather, Scott Walker, and mother, Sarah Walker, at its center. But behind closed doors, the bonds of trust and love that should define a family were fracturing in unimaginable ways. In July 2020, Bernadette disappeared. Her family claimed she had simply run away, a troubled teenager seeking independence. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, her absence began to raise unsettling questions. Why was there no trace of her? No messages, no sightings, no explanation. What followed was a case that gripped the nation, a story of betrayal, secrecy, and the unthinkable actions taken to silence a voice. A trial that would reveal shocking details about Bernadette's life and the people closest to her. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this case is what remains unanswered. To this day, Bernadette's body has never been found. This is the story of Bernadette Walker, a story of loss, deception, and the relentless search for justice. And it begins on a summer day in 2020, when a 17-year-old girl vanished into thin air. To understand the tragic story of Bernadette Walker, we must first step into her world, a world that seemed, at first glance, ordinary. Bernadette was a 17-year-old with a passion for photography. She often spent her days capturing fleeting moments, finding beauty in the mundane. Her friends described her as creative, funny, and a bit shy, but with a warmth that made her instantly likable. She dreamed of one day turning her love for photography into a career, imagining a future where her lens could tell stories of hope and resilience. But Bernadette's home life painted a far different picture than the hopeful future she envisioned. She lived in Peterborough with her large family, including her mother, Sarah Walker, and her stepfather, Scott Walker. On the surface, the Walkers seemed like a typical working-class family, managing the chaos of life with 6 other children in the household. But beneath that surface, cracks were beginning to show. Sarah Walker, Bernadette's mother, was described by acquaintances as stern and controlling. She ran the household with an iron grip, often prioritizing appearances over the well-being of her children. Scott Walker, her stepfather, presented himself as a devoted parent, but his relationship with Bernadette was far from ideal. In fact, Bernadette confided to her friends that she didn't trust Scott. There were moments when his behavior made her feel uncomfortable, but like many young people, she hesitated to voice her fears. After all, home was supposed to be a sanctuary. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Bernadette's diary became her only outlet, a place where she could write the truths she felt unable to say aloud. She detailed allegations of abuse at the hands of her stepfather, claiming he had betrayed her trust in the most unforgivable ways. Her diary entries revealed a girl torn between fear and the hope of being believed. In one chilling passage, she wrote, "Told my mom about my dad and the abuse. She called me a liar and threatened to kill me if I told the police." But even with these fears, Bernadette tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She continued attending college, meeting friends, and sharing her photography online. Her social media posts showed glimpses of a typical teenager, selfies with friends, snapshots of nature, and hopeful captions about the future. Yet, in the days leading up to her disappearance in July 2020, something changed. Bernadette's usually bubbly demeanor grew subdued. Friends later recalled how she seemed distracted, as if carrying a weight too heavy for her young shoulders. On July 17, she returned home from an overnight stay at a friend's house. That was the last time anyone outside her family would see her alive. Her stepfather, Scott Walker, would later claim that Bernadette had run away after an argument the following morning. He said she jumped out of his car and vanished without a trace. But what really happened that day? As investigators would later uncover, the truth about Bernadette's disappearance was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. On the morning of July 18, 2020, Scott Walker claimed he drove Bernadette Walker to her grandparents' house. According to him, an argument erupted in the car. He said she was upset, volatile, and eventually jumped out of the vehicle, refusing to come back. This was the last time anyone, outside of Scott's account, would claim to see Bernadette alive. But the timeline of that day, as pieced together later, raised more questions than answers. From 11:23 a.m. to 12:54 p.m., Scott Walker's phone was completely switched off, a critical 91-minute window during which no one could trace his movements. When the phone was powered back on, its location data showed he was near Cowbit, a rural area just outside Peterborough. This was an area known for its isolated fields and waterways. An area perfect for concealing secrets. Scott returned home that afternoon, but Bernadette wasn't with him. Instead, he told her mother, Sarah Walker, that Bernadette had run away after their argument. The family didn't report her missing until 3 days later, on July 21. By then, any potential evidence of her whereabouts had already begun to vanish. What unfolded next was a series of behaviors from both Scott and Sarah Walker that cast a dark shadow over their story. Rather than launching a desperate search for their daughter, they began deleting her social media accounts. Text messages between the couple revealed chilling conversations where they discussed how to mislead investigators. Sarah even suggested, "We stick to the story. She ran away." Amidst the growing suspicions, Bernadette's diary surfaced during the investigation. Its contents were devastating. In her own words, Bernadette detailed allegations of sexual abuse by Scott Walker, abuse she said had been ongoing for years. In one entry, she wrote, "I don't feel safe at home. I just want someone to believe me." This discovery painted Scott's version of events in a far more sinister light. Investigators now believed that Scott Walker killed Bernadette to silence her, eliminating the only witness to his alleged crimes. But Sarah Walker's role in the days following Bernadette's disappearance raised equally troubling questions. Why would a mother, confronted with her daughter's allegations of abuse, side with her alleged abuser? And why did she help destroy evidence and maintain a lie, even as public concern for Bernadette grew? Neighbors later recalled that the family acted strangely during this time. There were no visible search efforts, no public pleas for Bernadette's safe return. Instead, they kept to themselves, offering little information to authorities or the media. The inconsistencies in their story, combined with the damning evidence from Bernadette's diary, left investigators with a grim theory. Scott Walker hadn't driven Bernadette to her grandparents' house that morning. Instead, they believed he used those 91 minutes to ensure she would never be found. But despite their mounting suspicions, investigators faced an enormous challenge. They had no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no body. The truth of what happened during those 91 minutes remained locked away, known only to Scott Walker. On July 21, 2020, 3 days after 17-year-old Bernadette Walker had supposedly run away, her parents finally reported her missing to the police. This delay was the first red flag for investigators, setting the tone for what would become one of the most challenging cases in recent history. Initial search efforts were focused on locating Bernadette as a missing person. Police officers canvassed the Peterborough area, contacted her friends, and checked her known hangouts. But there was no sign of Bernadette, no communication, no sightings, and no activity on her social media accounts. As days turned into weeks, investigators grew increasingly concerned. It was highly unusual for a teenager to disappear without leaving any digital trail or reaching out to friends. And then came a critical piece of evidence. Bernadette's parents, Scott and Sarah Walker, were deleting her social media accounts and sending messages from her phone to create the illusion she was still alive. These actions immediately drew suspicion. Why would parents of a missing child take steps to erase her online presence? The messages sent from Bernadette's phone didn't match her usual tone, further raising doubts. Investigators began to suspect that Scott and Sarah Walker were hiding something. Then came another turning point. In September 2020, both Scott and Sarah Walker were arrested on suspicion of perverting the course of justice. During questioning, their stories began to unravel. Scott Walker's timeline of events came under intense scrutiny. Investigators analyzed his phone records and uncovered the crucial 91-minute window when his phone had been turned off. This, combined with data showing his location near Cowbit, suggested he had been in a remote area, an area that could easily conceal a crime. Meanwhile, Sarah Walker's role in the cover-up became increasingly apparent. Text messages between her and Scott revealed coordinated efforts to mislead authorities. In one exchange, Sarah reminded Scott to stick to the story, indicating a deliberate attempt to fabricate an alibi. But despite these revelations, investigators faced a significant obstacle: the absence of Bernadette's body. Without physical evidence, proving foul play would be far more difficult. Forensic teams searched the Cowbit area and other locations of interest, but the dense terrain and lack of specific leads made the search nearly impossible. As public concern for Bernadette grew, police issued appeals through the media, urging anyone with information to come forward. Her face appeared on posters and news broadcasts, and her friends and community members shared heartfelt pleas for her safe return. But the silence was deafening. The media coverage brought national attention to the case, but it also amplified the scrutiny on Scott and Sarah Walker. Their interviews appeared detached, their concern rehearsed. It was clear to investigators, and to much of the public, that they were withholding the truth. As evidence against the Walkers mounted, police formally charged Scott with Bernadette's murder in September 2020, despite the absence of her body. This decision marked a pivotal moment in the investigation, signaling that authorities were confident enough in the circumstantial evidence to pursue justice. But even with the arrests and charges, one haunting question remained unanswered: where was Bernadette Walker? The lack of closure weighed heavily on her friends, family, and the community, leaving a void that could never truly be filled. In June 2021, nearly a year after Bernadette Walker's disappearance, the trial of Scott and Sarah Walker began at Cambridge Crown Court. The courtroom was filled with tension as the prosecution laid out its chilling case against Bernadette's stepfather and mother. The prosecution argued that Scott Walker had a clear and horrifying motive. Bernadette's diary had exposed years of alleged sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather. Prosecutors stated that Scott, fearing exposure and the legal consequences that would follow, silenced Bernadette to protect himself. They presented the 91-minute window on July 18, 2020, when Scott's phone was turned off, as the critical period in which he murdered Bernadette and concealed her body. Prosecutor Lisa Wilding described Scott Walker as a man who, upon realizing Bernadette was ready to speak out, chose to eliminate the threat she posed. His solution, she told the court, was to silence her forever. As for Sarah Walker, the prosecution painted a picture of a mother complicit in covering up her daughter's murder. Text messages between Scott and Sarah were presented, revealing their coordinated efforts to delete Bernadette's social media accounts and maintain the narrative that she had run away. Sarah's actions, they argued, were driven by loyalty to Scott and a desperate attempt to preserve the family's fragile facade. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's case, focusing on the lack of direct physical evidence. Without Bernadette's body, they argued, there was no definitive proof of murder. Scott's legal team maintained that Bernadette had indeed run away, suggesting that she might still be alive. They claimed the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and emotional appeals. Sarah Walker's defense was equally fraught. Her barrister argued that she was manipulated by Scott and acted under his influence, trying to protect her family rather than participate in a crime. But the weight of the evidence against the Walkers was overwhelming. The prosecution's timeline, combined with Scott's suspicious behavior, Sarah's complicity, and Bernadette's haunting diary entries, left little room for doubt. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Scott Walker was found guilty of Bernadette's murder, as well as perverting the course of justice. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 32 years. Sarah Walker, while cleared of murder, was convicted of perverting the course of justice. She received a 6-year prison sentence. The sentences marked the end of a long and grueling legal battle, but for many, justice felt incomplete. Bernadette's body was never found, leaving her friends, family, and community without the closure they so desperately needed. The case of Bernadette Walker sent shockwaves through the nation. Media coverage highlighted the tragic failure of those closest to Bernadette to protect her. Public outrage was directed not only at Scott and Sarah Walker but at the systemic issues that allowed Bernadette's cries for help to go unheard. Vigils were held in Bernadette's honor, with community members coming together to mourn the young life cut short. Her story became a painful reminder of the importance of believing survivors and the devastating consequences of silence. Scott and Sarah Walker may have been held accountable, but Bernadette's case remains a haunting mystery. The absence of her body leaves a void that no verdict can fill. And so, her story endures, not just as a tale of tragedy, but as a call to action, to listen, to believe, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The tragic case of Bernadette Walker is a stark reminder of the challenges in seeking justice when the victim's body remains undiscovered. Prosecuting without physical evidence is an uphill battle, requiring investigators to rely on circumstantial details, behavioral analysis, and forensic data. In Bernadette's case, the evidence against Scott and Sarah Walker was compelling enough to secure convictions. Yet, the absence of her body leaves a painful void, one that continues to haunt those who loved her and those who fought for justice in her name. For the Peterborough community, Bernadette's disappearance left an indelible mark. Vigils were held, candles were lit, and posters of her face adorned street corners. But as the years passed, hope of finding her diminished. Despite extensive searches in rural areas and waterways, her remains were never recovered. The mystery surrounding her final resting place grew even more impenetrable in December 2023, when Scott Walker died in prison. He took with him the truth about what happened during those fateful 91 minutes on July 18, 2020. His refusal to cooperate, even in his final days, robbed Bernadette's family and community of the closure they so desperately needed. The dynamics within the Walker family continue to raise troubling questions. Sarah Walker's role, while less direct than Scott's, was critical in the cover-up. What led her to prioritize loyalty to her partner over the safety and justice owed to her own daughter? Was it fear, manipulation, or something more complex? These are questions that linger, unanswered, casting a long shadow over her 6-year prison sentence. But beyond the individual actions of Scott and Sarah Walker, this case speaks to broader societal issues, the importance of believing and supporting victims of abuse. Bernadette had spoken up, recording her fears and accusations in her diary. Yet her cries for help were met with dismissal and, ultimately, betrayal by those who should have protected her most. For survivors of abuse, cases like Bernadette's can be both a warning and a call to action. They remind us of the devastating consequences of silence, both on the part of victims, who may feel too afraid to come forward, and on the part of those who fail to listen. In the wake of Bernadette's story, advocates have called for increased awareness of familial abuse and better support systems for victims. Schools, communities, and social services must work together to identify and intervene in cases where children may be at risk. Bernadette Walker's story is one of heartbreak and injustice, but it is also a call to action, a plea for vigilance, compassion, and accountability. While the search for her remains continues, so does her legacy, a reminder of the responsibility we all share to protect the vulnerable and to ensure that their voices are heard. The case of Bernadette Walker is a heartbreaking tale of betrayal, silence, and justice without closure. At just 17 years old, Bernadette's life was taken in an act of unspeakable cruelty, and her body remains missing to this day. Scott Walker's death in prison has left lingering questions that may never be answered, and her family and community are left to grapple with the void she left behind. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think justice was truly served? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice is part of the conversation that keeps Bernadette's memory alive. And if you're intrigued by stories of crime and justice, subscribe to Timeless Crime. Join us next time as we uncover another shocking true crime story that will leave you questioning everything.